Hello, everyone. This is going to be our tabletop games themes for 2021, creating games for the future, a discussion on trends and themes for tabletop games panel. I'm Jackson Wood, and I'm just going to start with Kathleen. Why do you have the credentials? Why should people listen to you? Kick it off for us.
Well, hopefully I'm funny. And barring that, no, I'm a middle school teacher by trade, but I started teaching game design to my students, and then I did it too because I hate the expression "those who can't do teach." And I've got 3 games now with various publishers. My first one, Grease, as in the country, Grease Lightning, coming out with WizKids in June 2021. So I'm very excited to finally have my name on a game on a box on the shelf. And yeah, and I just love talking about games and game design. I'll throw it to Isaac.
Yeah, my name is Isaac Vega. I've been working in the board game industry for over 10 years. I mostly worked for Plaid Hat, but recently started my own company called Gauntlet Entertainment, along with my co-owner, Lindsay Rode. I'm most known for designs such as Dead of Winter, Ashes, BioShock Infinite, the board game. And I absolutely love designing board games, and I'm still going to be planning on doing this until I'm dead. So that's why I'm here.
Heck yeah, we'll kick it to somebody else.
All right, Catherine, go ahead and take us off.
Yeah, I'm Catherine Stippel. I use she, her pronouns. I designed a game called Nyctophobia a couple years back, which was based around playing a board game blind without any sort of accommodations. And I'm also a moderator for the remote playtesting online playtesting group that meets bi-weekly, and so I see a lot of prototypes.
Awesome.
Yeah.
That leaves me.
Yeah, I was going to say, it just leaves you.
Yeah, I'm Paul Alexander Butler. I wear a lot of different hats in the industry. On the design end of things, I mostly work in RPGs. Mainly, you might know me from Overlight that I did for Renegade Game Studios. I'm also co-owner of Gaming Days, which is the company that runs Free RPG Day and Board Game Expo. And I think mainly I'm here because I own and manage a great big game store, so I can provide a bit of a retail perspective on themes going forward.
Well, awesome. I'm just going to start super generic, and then I know some of you kick some questions to me, but I'm just going to start with the very basic question, which is like designing with themes. Like, where do you all start? Like, how do you like to start? You know, all those kinds of things, like a very top-down sort of beginning. Before we start getting into the more specific, whoever wants to take, Paul, since you were last for introduction, why don't you kick it off here? Like,
Sure. I mean, I'm a theme guy, so I always start from theme. That being said, I mean, folks like Reiner Knizia, some of the folks that have been around a really long time that are mostly mathematicians. I know Kathleen doesn't really care to talk about math, but here we are. A lot of those folks will come up with systems first, and then kind of design themes around that. That's not how I work at all. I'm very much a theme-driven person. So I try to come up with a novel theme and go from there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I feel very similar to Paul. I like to see what theme do I want to explore, what is really grabbing me with the story, how do I want to represent these characters. That's what kind of threw me into the design industry in the first place. Mechanics have always been like just incredibly intriguing to me, but if they don't fit within the theme that I'm trying to represent, they're out. You know, even if it's one of the most unique or interesting mechanics that I've come up with. I've designed many different prototypes that I've put to the side that I thought that was really cool, and that had a really good system, but it just didn't lend to the theme or the story or the feeling that I wanted to bring across. So for me, like most of my games kind of are known for more of like bringing across a story or showing off the specific worlds. And yeah, like I really want to make sure that it's trying to reach the intention of the theme, and if the mechanics don't serve it, then they're out.
Mm-hmm. I would hear from Catherine first.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think the way I get game ideas a lot is I do something weird with a component, and then the theme either comes right after that, or I drop the design because it's like, oh, I just moved this way, and it's like, oh, that made me feel like I'm changing my gravity. So now I have this gravity space game and I can run with it. So if those two things don't click right together, I normally lose the design idea.
Interesting.
Yeah, for me, my very first game was called Dirty Birdie, and now it's Ragnarok. But it started off as like, wouldn't it be funny if there was a game where like pigeons were pooping on people, and then it turned into a whole thing, and then it actually worked. And it was like, how do I take this real world and sort of like gamify within that sort of very real world context? But then for my next game was a game that was a just sort of generic race game. And I hated it. It was one that actually my ex-partner started, and I like kind of like wedged myself in there. And and so looking at how does the theme serve the mechanics, but also how does the mechanics serve the theme? And that game is interesting, I think, because like I had to try so many things mechanically to get it, and I feel like that was like one of the best exercises for at least developing on that side. And then my third game, Valkyrie, was one where I was asked to make a game about Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and that was an interesting question. Like, how do you make a game about a single person? And like how, like especially somebody like Ruth Bader Ginsburg, like how do you like, what do you do? Is it like 3 versus 1, like Ruth versus everyone else is playing the patriarchy? I mean, like what do you do?
A Letters from Whitechapel scenario.
Yeah. So in the end, everybody got to be Ruth, but then it ended up not getting picked up. But so I changed it to Valkyrie, which was something else. And so, yeah, I mean, my favorite game from a design perspective is Survive Escape from Atlantis, the old game. Oh, it's actually in the movie Gremlins too. They featured some of it on the shelves there. And but it's like such a good marriage of theme and mechanics. Like you can't extricate them from each other. And that to me is, I think, like what themes should do is just makes the game so intuitive in terms of the choices that you get to make as a player.
Yeah, I agree completely, Kathleen. Like when a game can kind of hit that perfect synergy in which what you're doing just automatically makes sense to the player, not having understood the entire game or how every system functions, but it's like, oh, that makes sense. I know that makes sense in the world that I'm role playing as, or I'm coming into it in. It makes the game so much easier for people to absorb and teach. One of the things that I think was really successful with Dead of Winter is that kind of synergy between the mechanics and the theme that people understood as they were coming into the game. That makes sense to me. I'm coming in, I'm a survivor, I'm going to go ahead and be dealing with these issues. And because of that, the mechanics and theme blended really well to each other. And for Dead of Winter, which used to, like, I thought was going to be a game that was going to be harder for people to understand than it ended up being. And so many people ended up coming into the industry through that game when nobody would think of Dead of Winter as a introductory game. But because the theme and the mechanics can merge so seamlessly, a lot of people just started getting what they were doing, or the intention of what they were doing, because of the theme and how the mechanics blended together.
That's a really good point. I saw a very similar thing. I was a retail owner way back in the day as well, kind of like Paul, and that was a game that came out when I was, and I saw a very similar trend just on the local level. So absolutely, it's a really cool thing to see the intuitiveness really come out from the two blending together, as you said.
Yeah. Well, there's one game, Radis. It's like an anecdote about the Black Death.
One of my favorites.
It's such a good game.
Did not get the love it deserves. It's so good.
Yeah, it's
at least not in the States.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. It's really good. But it's one of those games that when talking about the importance of theme, if you describe that game in purely abstract terms, you'd be like, what is happening? The theme just makes all the different bits and pieces work together. Yep. So I think that's something to think about. Like, A, retheming, especially if you're wanting to design, be ready with some different ideas in your back pocket. Because when I sold my pigeon game, we immediately started talking about dragons, which are just, old pigeons, I guess.
Angrier pigeons.
Right, they're just fireball stuff as opposed to, poop bomb stuff, but
Fire pigeons. It's fine.
Yeah.
I'm going to use that to sort of jump into one of the questions Paul had, because it all sort of went there. But Paul's question was just like, what is the success of a game? I'm just going to read it verbatim, if that's okay.
Yeah,
what does the success of a game like Wingspan say about the potential success of non-genre themes going forward? And since you've been a little bit more quiet, Catherine, I apologize if I'm putting you on the spot. Would you like to kick this one off for everybody? You don't have to.
Yeah, sure. I think looking at games that have been playtested a lot in the remote playtesting group that I'm a part of, we have a lot of like food games right now. So that's kind of a more of a unexplored theme. I think maybe that's partly due to the pandemic, the world situation. Cooking and baking and stuff is something that you can do a lot.
I was
of
about
people
to
have picked
say,
up.
everybody's making banana bread now.
Yeast, the rising.
Oh my
Yeah.
God.
You
And
see a
raise your hands for
ton.
the COVID-19. Hey.
Yeah.
Food games you see a ton of out of Japan, like in general, but it's exciting to see that there's even more food games coming.
Yeah, and I think too, I've seen a lot just talking to other people or seeing through Twitter a desire for less like combat-y, violent type theme games. Like my mom, we play King of Tokyo together, and like that has a very loose violence theme, but she will always play the pacifist. She'll just try to roll the numbers and just totally avoid rolling the claws, or if she rolls claws, she gets upset about it. So like being able to open up the hobby, even just like King of Tokyo, which is like a gateway type of game that my mom still has a bit of reluctance to play because of that small, tiny violent mechanic to it. I think we see a swing towards those interesting themes.
Well, and like for my students, I don't let my students design games with person-to-person violence, just because it's like I hit you, you hit me back, and the way they do it, it gets real repetitive really, really quickly. Like they're having so much fun making these like ornate cards with all these math problems, and then it just like you're like, okay, I hit you, okay, now you hit me. Like it doesn't quite work the way they think it's usually going to work, but I think that's because I said there's a lot more interesting conflict out there that I want you to explore between players, and that's way harder to do, to come up with. If I've got a dolphin game, if we're gonna have dolphins hit each other, cool, I'm gonna spit water at you, I'm gonna blowhole you, I'm gonna whack you with my tail. But if there's something else the dolphins have to do to compete with, then I think that just opens you up to other types of ways that people can play games that give them a different experience, which I just think is what people were wanting, is a different type of experience that theme lent itself to.
Yeah, I mean, as somebody who does the majority of board game buying for my business, there's not a week that goes by that I'm looking to order new games for games and stuff in my store, and it's yet another sort of knights and dragons and swords and fireballs.
Mm-hmm.
And I understand that is the backbone of the industry for a variety of reasons, but so much of it just starts looking the same after a while, and like it's very difficult to get excited about this stuff, from week to week or even year to year. So when something like Wingspan comes along, it's not even the theme, but it's the theme and the art direction. The fact that it wasn't some cartoony or stylized, but the fact that they went almost the Audubon route. That I was having people that never had set foot in my store before trying to find this game because they'd read about it, in the New York Times or in their birding group right. Or whatever. So, I don't, there's a long trope about, in fantasy role-playing games, especially, like people want to create their own fantasy heartbreaker. Like, they need we need another game with elves and dwarves and orcs and trolls. I mean, there's a place for that, and I love it. I mean, I have a Tolkien tattoo on my neck. I get it, but I think there's so much space out there just to talk about other things. And to Catherine's point, like they don't always need to be about beating the crap out of each other.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think too with Wingspan, what also was very much shown in the design of that game is how much love, research, and passion went into that design. There is just so much there that if you are someone who loves learning about animals, loves bird watching, has another hobby that's related to this game, is suddenly an introductory point into the industry that's going to be like, well, I really love this stuff already. I want to go ahead and find out more about it. And this game did such a homage to, I know that Elizabeth Hargrave loves bird watching herself, and that was part of the passion that came through in that design so clearly. And they also sought out artists that were also specifically passionate in drawing that style of birds, and had them expand into doing it for the game. And they did it was just such a beautiful melding of all of those different passions coming together And that showed in the design, and it was also just a phenomenal engine building design.
Sure.
There's so many different aspects that came together. But I think like you could have had that phenomenal engine building, but without the passion, I don't think it would have been nearly as successful.
Well, and I think one thing about the theme too harkens back to what Paul was saying, and that it expanded the industry. It expanded it expanded the existing gaming industry, but it also expanded people's idea of what the gaming industry could be, you know, because one of the reasons why my game was switched from pigeons to dragons is because dragons sell better, you know. And I think what Wingspan shows us is you can have a lot of non-traditional themes and that they can work and they can sell. And you can't just like, you know, slap cheeseburgers on something and be like, okay, here's the new game. I mean, like, there's got to be like, you know, intelligence, wit, creativity behind it. But I think too, in intentionally looking at a wider variety of themes, like think about, there's the one at Calico. I mean, like even Patchwork, and I mean, there's so many others. And you know, for a lot of times, sometimes people are like, and I don't necessarily know if we want to get into this, but especially if there's like things that like women, like, you know, then people, you know, kind of get a little uneasy, you know. So I think it just has to do with like shifting market, what the gaming industry is, who are gamers. I think all of that is lumped in there too. And Catherine, Elizabeth gave a really great talk at Tabletop Network about just things that from, not necessarily from just a variety of different sources in terms of like what she thinks, you know, Wingspan tells us about the gaming industry. And, you know, yeah, there's definitely a desire for a lot less combat driven games.
Yeah. And it's really interesting to touch on the subject that like people might feel like they're, like people aren't going to click on this game or look into this game if it feels like it's, marketed towards women in some sort of way, which is really like, it's really interesting because I'm working on a game right now, Keystone North America, which is very much in the same vein of like nature driven. It focuses on species, it focuses on education, on these kinds of things as well. And it's so funny to see how the marketing still actually tends to be, there are more men that click on this ad than women do. So it's interesting as well to see that there is not necessarily, it doesn't have to be dragons in order to get men's attention.
Right.
Either. So to just say that is not the truth. People do desire different themes, different things outside of the fantasy and space exploration themes that are so prevalent within the industry.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
And one last thought. I mean, I think that the games exploded during the pandemic. Demand and desire for games exploded during the pandemic. So there are so many gamers now who are waiting to burst out of their homes. And so deliver a buffet of product. Don't just specialize so hardcore into like a small little niche.
Right.
Oh, absolutely. Well, I'm just going to keep picking on Paul because like that question kind of fed into this one, but I'm going to modify your original one a little bit to make it a little bit broader. So Paul's second question was just, what should the discussion regarding themes about the age of exploration and colonialism look like? You know, is this something we should grow beyond? And it kind of like, I'm tying it into Wingspan too, like opening up themes, talking about greater things, the reflection of society into games being very important, like reflecting the people who play games in games, representation across the board. Like, I'm going to start with you, Paul, but to everyone, it's probably one of the biggest topics we'll cover today, but please, everyone.
Sure. So you sort of threw a lot more in there. Like, I mean, so
tackling more, but yeah. Please.
Yeah. I mean, so as far as I'm concerned, the issue of representation is like the people that are gonna poo-poo the idea of everybody needs to be represented in games. Just need to get with the program or go on somewhere else. Like we all need to be represented in every, you know, across the board. Specifically to the stuff like Age of Exploration. While I understand the appeal of those sorts of games, it's really curious to me just how many there have been in the history of board games in particular. And I'm sure that comes out of, you know, the sort of DNA of wargaming, and, you know, what they call 4X games, you know, exploration and you know, and a lot of conflict, frankly. Now, once upon a time, I was an anthropology student, so I'm interested in history, and I'm interested in the way in which different cultures have sort of run afoul of each other. And I think there's a space for those sorts of games, but I think to do it without acknowledging how problematic those stories can be, and to do it without involving the voices of those people who were seriously damaged and whose cultures were seriously damaged by those events, is a misstep. There have been a few games recently that have kind of sort of addressed it. I think, a bit of verbiage in the rulebook about historical context goes a long way. But more importantly, I think having those marginalized voices involved in the conversations and the design of those games is really what needs to happen.
Mhm.
And as much as we all love Puerto Rico, I think that's in a lot of ways kind of the worst example of things, because you just kind of pretend it's not problematic, like, oh, these brown cubes are workers, and it's to not address the seriously problematic issues at hand, I think is troubling all around. I hope that answered the question.
Yeah, it was I was more just opening up wider because it's the two are going to kind of go hand in hand. To some
Sure.
extent. So I figure I'd just do it now.
Well, I
Yeah.
think. Go ahead, Isaac.
I'm sorry. No, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, especially when you think about how Eurocentric a lot of history is, both in Europe and also in the US, in terms of not necessarily being as representative. So like the narratives that people learn and taught are very much, from the perspective of the victor, if you want to, look at it from that way. And so I think looking at your, expanding your, I think it's okay if a designer wants to make a game about a different culture, about a different time and place. Otherwise, we're going to have very, very narrow channels. Like, if you want the game that about my life today would be about ordering Papa John's and eating chicken wings, I don't know that that's the most exciting thing. I was good at the time. But my point is, that was a really dumb example. But my point is, you have to do your research. You have to learn. You have to, like you said, like Paul said, become sensitive to it so that and get the other people involved. But you have to really think, like, what's your default? If your default is coming from this very narrow perspective, then it's going to show and it's going to become evident in the thinness of the design.
Yeah, I think you bring up a really excellent point too, Kathleen, on just kind of like the perspective of not only like what most history is taught in schools from, like what we're seeing in these games. That's what we learned in high school and middle school, and that's the history, the narrative that we were fed when we were young. So that, in a way, is almost familiar to the culture in its entirety. And because we're not familiar with these other things, even though plenty of other games out of other cultures are being created, especially more so nowadays, they might not be receiving the amount of attention because it's just not familiar. We were talking earlier about how themes can sometimes bring people in to a design because you understand it. You understand how it functions, how it's going to feel, and sometimes it'll let you get around the mechanics. And because board games, they're great, they're fantastic, but a lot of them are hard to learn and offer a lot of confusing moments. Sometimes people don't like being put in that situation, right? So themes are sometimes a very amazing bridge to let people into it. And the more not familiar a theme can be, the harder sometimes people can get into it. And also, when designers are like looking for themes within their head, they're going to draw from their experiences as well. So there's not only an issue within the industry with that, there's an issue in our entire culture that kind of comes around the fact that there are so many of those types of games. It's funny that you brought up Puerto Rico, Paul, because Puerto Rico is one of the first games I was ever introduced to in the industry at all. And I very much enjoyed the mechanics, but I would be lying if my white friends that were teaching me weren't joking around those brown cubes on the table. So it's something that I have like, there are certain games and certain themes that I try to avoid just in general. I don't necessarily love Age of Exploration themes, but I also ask myself, like, why do we see things like this also reflected in so many other other types of games, because we see this in space, we see this in fantasy, this type of feeling of like we are going somewhere, we are taking over. And what is it about our culture in general that we desire to see that in the things that we play with, and how we kind of bring that out into the real world as well.
Catherine, any thoughts from you?
Yeah, I think everybody really covered a lot of things. I know, like Long Island, we have a lot of towns named after from the Native Americans names we've taken. And I know on Twitter a bit ago, there was like a thread about, oh, what would a board game based on your town be like? And I looked at it, and I looked at my town, which is, taken from the Native American language. And like, I can't approach that topic without looking into the history of the Native Americans that lived here, or finding consultants of like, I don't even know too much about what life was like here with the Native Americans. So I think it was just an eye-opening thing for me to just either learn about what happened in the past here, whether I design a game about it or not, or just to broaden my horizons.
Yeah. And so, not to leave the second part of Paul's question to that, it kind of got touched on a little bit, but like, are topics like that, specifically in the case of colonial or even just these kinds of games, are those things that we should get rid of? Or, should we be changing them? How should we be approaching that topic going forward in regards to themes and trends?
I think Isaac hit it when he said, what does it say about our culture at large that we need to keep having these kinds of games and stories? I think maybe finding a way to ask that question within the confines of the game is the way forward, right?
Yeah, I like how Catherine was talking about like exploring your history in your own area and where you grew up, because that's one of the things that I've kind of been exploring within my own designs as well as of late, kind of diving into my Dominican heritage and seeing, and a lot of, Dominican Republic was one of the first places that was colonized from European people, and just to kind of understand my history a little bit more does give me ideas, but I also want to bring that into my design in a way that's not exploitative or presenting things in a way that's going to teach other people different things that is not necessarily than the people that are more attached to that culture than I necessarily am, because even though I was born there and I was raised by a Dominican mother, I did not grow up there. So I have to also toe that line and understand what my position is in representing stories like that. So it's a very interesting way to kind of like, how do we do a responsible job of being able to tell things from maybe the opposite end of the spectrum that we normally have been able to see, but also like Paul was reiterating when I said earlier, is like, why are we so drawn to these stories? But it's interesting because I think humans from a long time ago, our entire species evolved, hunter-gatherer. We're moving into different regions all the time. That is what our species is. And then we kind of, in the last short amount of history, in the full aspect of time, like we're just in a small blip, we've actually nested and stopped doing that. So there might be something even deeper there that we haven't even answered yet and seen as to why that is. But it's interesting too, because I see a lot of, I'm personally concerned, like, and this is about not board games anymore. I'm personally concerned about what we decide to do in space exploration, like just in general, because I don't feel like we've answered the question of why we're obsessed with this. We've answered the question what is responsible to do moving forward, because we're still doing this around the world, even though it's not necessarily seen very or talked about very much, and seeing how we take that into the future. And I just don't think we've answered those questions that are responsible. Even a lot of our space exploration games we see those as like, oh, you're a corporation taking over Mars. Like, because that's the ethical thing to do, I guess.
Because that's how we all see that playing out.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. And
Do they
and
admit
that's
that it's
interesting.
ethical?
And maybe it's about presenting, not necessarily going and reformatting the past, but taking that concept and visualizing a future in which we could do it better.
I think just to interject, I think we've seen some trends of that, not necessarily important, but culture in general with solar punk as an example. This sort of dystopian future of punk futures we've seen, like cyberpunk, etc. And now we see solar punk, which is a more positive future theme out of that same sort of category.
Yeah. I mean, and likewise, like as far as like women go, it's like in movies, if you could replace a woman with a lamp and it doesn't really change much in the story, like maybe she's not quite the active agent that you're thinking she is, to sort of take that approach to like all people who are being represented, in a game. Like, I think there can be real value in having like difficult, challenging topics be the subjects of games. I mean, because people oscillate, like games are as entertainment, but also as like simulations, as that you could gain perspective into someone else's, life and experiences. Like, I think there absolutely is a place for, all different types of themes. But I think it's just your intentionality in terms of how you choose to represent everyone as authentically and as fairly and in an informed way as you can.
Sure.
Any other thoughts from folks on that before I sort of segue that into a more general topic that may continue down this path?
Segue away.
Cool. So just talking about trends in general, because we haven't talked about that too much, we've touched on it, but what do you all feel is currently trendy and kind of why, tying into this, of like talking about the subversion a little bit? I don't like that word, but we talked about like how do we approach it from a different perspective, potentially, those trends as well, and make them something fresher or different. It's sort of trends and themes together. If you want to start, Isaac, since I haven't
well, I'll take it from a point of confusion. So
I may not be explaining it well.
I mean, Paul, you might have a better aspect or understanding of where trends are than I do, because I don't run a store. But being someone who's kind of, mostly plugged into the industry, as we're all designers, I'm sure there's moments in our history when we're so focused in on our own games that we just don't pay attention to anything else that's going on. So there's definitely lapses in my understanding during those moments, especially when also running a company. I try to pay attention to as much stuff that comes up, but honestly, 2020 and 2021, it's been crazy. It's been crazy. I'm seeing things come up that people haven't talked about in years. I'm seeing things people are like, there's tons and tons of new things coming out, but nothing's really catching fire. And it's just
that's really astute. I've had that exact conversation with fellow retailers.
Yeah,
like there's no huge breakout hits.
Right, and I just think it's because we don't have our central hit maker events anymore. We just don't. And when when you pay attention at a con, like there's the narrative and the news and all of the content creators are talking about what was the hit of the show and what happened. And now the content creators can't really talk about that. They don't have that moment to talk about it. And really, content creators, especially the big ones, they form the feeling of the industry moving in a certain way. There are certain games, very, very special games like Wingspan that we talked about, that can start that narrative and I think do a really good job. But the more of like these kind of big events, these areas in which everybody can come together and start really formulating what the hits are, isn't happening. So because that's not happening, everybody's kind of like in their own corner, doing their own thing, playing what's engaging them, playing what they have access to. Because sometimes like, oh yeah, this might be the best game ever, but I don't have 7 people to play with, so it doesn't matter to me right now. I'm gonna play this dueling card game because I have one other person and that's all I have. Or I'm gonna go straight deep into solo games because that's what love, or I'm going to go ahead and play all the games that I possibly can on Tabletopia that are fun to play on Tabletopia. But there are some games that just don't translate to that. The only thing I can say definitively is dexterity games aren't doing good right now.
Well aware, having had one announced in 2020 for the
I don't
company
think
I used to work
dexterity
for.
games are doing great.
No,
no, mine's been shelved. No, I mean not like permanently, but like they're
Right.
waiting until there's cons so that people
Right.
can experience it and play
Exactly.
with it. Because yes, can confirm. But I think even before, what I think is interesting is before the pandemic,
Mhm.
what a lot of people were talking about was like the board game bubble. That
Yeah.
that 20 years ago, 15 years ago at Essen, like 50 games would come out. Now it's like
Mhm.
thousands.
Yeah.
And so and that was a big topic of discussion: is when will the market pop? When there's just so many little companies that will just go by the wayside. And in some ways, it was kind of interesting to see, like especially in the pandemic, is this what it's going to be? Like, are there little companies that aren't going to survive this because they don't have cons and all that? And so, it definitely seemed like bigger companies definitely hung on more. If there were little companies, hopefully they were, staffed by people who had other jobs too. And so I think there's going to be a whole lot of interesting shifts that come from these two big, massive forces kind of like
Yes.
resolving themselves over the next 12, 18, 24 months.
But what I also see too, when you talk about the bigger companies, I also see the bigger companies still suffering or is still experiencing. Nothing they're really doing is kind of making the hit or the statement that normally used to just like catch fire and stay forever and like be the thing that everybody talked about for the year. Like they're just, oh, that's cool. You're doing that. That's awesome.
Well, a lot of the smart publishers stretched out their release schedule. They said,
Yes.
here's my 10 games that we're going to come out in 2020. We're going to put out 4 or 5 instead.
Mhm.
So they're, because that marketing ecosystem is dead. I mean, it's not even that it slowed down. It just keeled over and died. Like that whole lifespan of like, we announce a thing, some influencers get a thing, then we airship in a pallet just for Gen Con or just from some other event, and we sell out, people play it, they take it back, their friends want it, then it hits the game stores and they run out and buy. Like that whole chain is dead. Like none of it's there. So it's just, you've got crowdfunding, you've got influencers, and you've got the game hitting the shelf. Right. And what I'm afraid is going to happen right now is, again, even though the smart publishers sort of spread out their releases, there's enough smart ones out there that we're going to have another bottleneck come the end of the year. I mean, global shipping logistics notwithstanding, which is a whole nother conversation. There's going to be so many releases that stuff's going to get lost. I mean, I started my retail career in the music industry back when there were record stores, and it would happen every year. Like fourth quarter would roll around and all of the big guns would come out, or even the medium size, releases, and they'd get, this was the 90s. So the up and coming bands would get drowned out by the U2 and the Whitney Houston releases, and you wouldn't even get to hear about the cool new thing. And I see that happening in board games a lot. As far as the bubble goes, I'm split whether or not there is one. I do think there's a certain type of consumer that just buys more and more and more games and buys bigger price point games. And, yes, I will take the 6th expansion for that game. I think those people are going to run out of room, frankly.
Yeah.
But, when I look at games, that the ones that have come closest to being breakout hits in the last year or so are the ones that are expanding the market to brand new consumers. And in that way, I don't think we're going to see a bubble. I think if we're continuing to broaden our reach, we're only going to see greater trends. But I think some of the alpha consumers, if you will, might end up a little frazzled and might get burnt out. Or just run out of closet space. Like how many, $300 Kickstarters with a bajillion miniatures are you going to fit in your house?
Exactly. And I agree completely with that. And I also just see like I think people in the industry, when they're scared about the bubble, they just kind of don't know how to market or attract people outside of what they've been attracting and marketing to already.
Yes.
And they're very like, well, there's just too many games coming out for these people. Well, there's like 7 billion people on this planet, right? And pretty much everyone you sit down at a table and actually teach a game to pretty much enjoys some aspect of what you just taught them. Every time you try, something happens. So we need to do a better job of understanding, number one, your market is so much bigger than it's ever been, and it's going to keep growing, and we can do it, but we need to make an effort to do that. And number two, we also have to understand you're getting older, other people are getting older. There's always new people that are going to be nerds that are willing to buy your product. It's just going to happen.
Oh.
Yeah, I was going to say, like, at the end of every year, I look at my top 20 board games by units sold for the year, and about half of them are the hits that anybody could have expected. But the other half are games that I decided I was going to make a hit. And I do that by whether it's a demo or whatever, it's a game that I don't think got the exposure. It just needs to be shown to the right people. Yeah. And not for nothing, like Catherine's game was one of them a couple years ago. The minute you've got that thing open and you're showing people this game that you're playing with your, blindfolded, and to say nothing of the story of how you created it, it was a game that I don't know that it ever would have been a hit if I had just decided to put some on a shelf. But because I decided, and frankly, I'd seen you at Unpub first, and then I think it was before it got signed even, and then by the time it hit my stores, I decided, well, this is a thing that I'm going to consciously decide to make a hit, because I can put it in front of eyeballs, no pun intended, given the game. I can put it in front of eyeballs that might not have otherwise seen it, and they're going to get excited about this thing that's very different, and it feels fresh and different, and that was a hit for me that year. So much to Isaac's point, like, the market's there, but the publishers need to realize that they're targeting not just people that use the word gamer to describe themselves.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so many people who aren't.
It's going to be incredibly interesting to see how conventions shift in this post-COVID world. And I believe there needs to be a shift. I don't think that we can just return to the way things were. I think that there needs to be quite a bit of changes that take place, not only to help keep people safer, because even before the pandemic, we were all getting sick after those cons. We were just all getting sick after those cons. Mm-hmm. And we need to understand better ways to be able to keep the populace healthy in general, and more people are just going to be conscious of that in general as well. And also trying to figure out ways, how can these conventions, or a whole bunch of smaller conventions, be supported by publishers in the industry across the United States, because I think people are going to shift more towards smaller events. And we have to figure out how can we make a presence at all of these events without destroying our bandwidth as well as publishers.
And when you say smaller, do you mean like sort of medium-sized regional events, or do you mean like truly localized?
I think more people, especially the people that you're talking about that have these gigantic games, they're going to start saying, you know what, I don't need to go to convention. I already know 30 people in my backyard. And I can go ahead and rent this or do this, or we can go ahead and get these spaces and get some people together and start our own little con. And we don't have to go and expose ourselves or be in a scary situation that we don't know about. It's really going to be very dependent on how the big shows end up running their shows later this year, and the narrative that comes out of that. If the narrative is positive, maybe we go back to that. If the narrative is negative, I think that's going to be very hard sell for a lot of people that have been established in this in the hobby for a long time and are scared of being immunocompromised or getting in a situation where they could get potentially sick, because we already have that narrative from conventions. You're going to get sick. That's what happens.
One thing, and I especially want to hear Catherine's thoughts on this, though, is especially from a design perspective, that there's been so much more now available for online game design events, game pitching events, and it's meant that cost is no longer the barrier to going. If you couldn't afford to go to a con, then that's no longer a barrier. It meant that if somebody, had, introvert all the way to social anxiety, that you could pitch a game from behind a computer, and get the same amount of consideration that somebody might if they actually go to a game con. And so, like, for myself, from an education perspective, if education goes back the way that it was, pre-COVID, we will have lost so many ways to really truly embark upon the way that people are living and working in the 21st century. We will not be preparing our children if we just pretend like this whole like digital connected world of remote learning and working doesn't exist anymore. And so same way with cons, if they just snap back where they're just meant to be these sort of like, you know, niche sort of little events for just a very small cluster of people, then it'll be that same sort of retraction again. You know, people have been playing games like crazy, and game conventions are, to me, one of the best, most fun things. One of my favorite places in the world is to be at game conventions with my friends. And so what can we do to open those doors even wider to other people, to let them know that these spaces exist? So for Catherine, so for you especially, how do you see, like, how did remote, oh shoot, dog is barking. But so real quick, how did like remote like game playtesting change over the course of the pandemic from the beginning to like now?
So the remote playtesting group started just as the New York City designers had started it up, and then it's expanded, you know, to people worldwide. So just having those views of people who are totally on a different continent, country from you, has been really interesting. And especially with like in terms of like cost and travel, I can just roll out of bed and hop on with a microphone rather than take, you know, spend a couple hours on a train, walk around until I find the place. Or like conventions. I haven't gone to too many online conventions, but if I see one, it's not like, oh, I've missed my chance, I can't book a flight now to Florida to go. I can just sign up, roll out of my bed, and now I'm at a convention the day of that I found out about it, which is very interesting for me.
As somebody who organized close to 50 virtual conventions last year, let me tell you, yes.
50, Jackson?
Yes, 50. And that's not an underestimate. Like, that was part of my job last year, was doing.
Oh my gosh.
Because we did a lot of smaller shows, just like you're saying, those really small, like, local community shows that, you know, really didn't have a large we're sort of getting towards the end of this, and so I'm going to continue asking more open from that, though. We kind of touched on it briefly. 2020, 2021, trends that we saw before, as you said, Isaac, confusion. Like, we don't really know what those are. But all of you in your specific, unique positions with these trends, with these themes, how do you feel going forward from 2020, 2021 now in that sort of topic? Like, how are you approaching themes and trends now with all of this having happened?
I'll start if that's okay. Yeah, I mean, so I've got some data. Having basically watched stuff sell from my not small store over the past year. I mean, obviously, out the gate, there were a lot of people interested in solo games and a lot of people interested in two-player games. The two-player game thing continues, and I think it'll be that way for a while. I also think that there's a sweet spot of a game that plays in about an hour or less and whose price point is about $40 or less, that those are the games that are the huge hits for me. And by huge, I mean really breaks out to sell, you know, a couple hundred copies or something, as opposed to something, you know, even a big sort of gamer game that's a hit doesn't come close to that. So I think, you know, for all of the we could argue about whether or not the phrase gateway game is the right word, but the gateway style games are the ones that are really continuing to sell and continuing to be the ones that sort of spike through with really high success rates for me. The challenge is going to be, again, with all of this, the various issues with global infrastructure. I do see prices rising by the end of the year, and that's going to make life really interesting. I think Q4 is going to be very difficult for a lot of smaller retailers.
I think it's funny because before we started recording, I asked how much did everybody think it was going to cost for me to ship 100 cubic feet to Romania, where I'm moving, and Paul nailed it. right? So I think he understands global logistics very
I get, yeah. I mean, I'm no expert, but I often get multiple pallets of games shipped to my store that I have to pay for, so I understand.
yeah. Yeah. So I will say credit there. Yeah, I mean, honestly, like I don't know. Like, I mean, as far as for me goes, I mean, this has been a rough year in terms of design because teaching right now remotely and converting everything that I have that has been based on in-person collaboration between students to shifting to an online remote model. I mean, I'm exhausted. So when it comes to like, like, okay, let me design a game, it's like, well, I just designed like 15 things today, And so I think I think that's one thing that a lot of creative people have been struggling with. Like all of a sudden we had all kinds of time, but there are all kinds of other pressures and anxieties and everything going on. So I just think that for anyone who feels like they should have done more than they did this year, be kind to yourself. You did the best you could. You are here. You did everything that you needed to do. Hopefully you'll get some time to like get outside and maybe see some more friends and family and start to recharge a bit. I don't expect that to happen right away, especially if you've got little kids and everything. We are humans first, and you'll get back to being in the swing of whatever your new normal will be at some point. Just be kind to yourself, and you're doing everything you can.
Catherine, Isaac, either of you, whoever wants to take it next, if anything, of course.
Catherine, you can go first.
Yeah, I think what Paul said about more lighter, shorter games. I think I see that in the remote playtesting that we do, because a game that would take like an hour in real life is going to take like double that in Tabletop Simulator. So people are making smaller games so that people are more likely to playtest them, given the constraint of the platforms that we have. So those would get played more. And then I'm interested to see, there's a lot of prototypes, and myself a bit included, that have only existed on a digital format like Tabletop Simulator or Tabletopia. So I know my game works really well because I can use the search deck function and find things really easily. But when we bring that to real life, am I rolling too many dice? Am I going to take too long trying to find these cards? That shift is going to be really interesting to see when people start making physical prototypes to play with other people again.
That's such an important point that I think a lot of people just don't even think about right now.
Yeah.
So that's awesome.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah.
Well, to add to that, all of those were fantastic points, and I definitely empathize and feel a lot of the same things, for sure. I'm in an interesting position because I decided to start a company in 2020, for me and Lindsay moving forward, our thought process is like, here we are, we're kind of at a shift in our lives just in general. The pandemic hit at this moment in which we wanted to kind of move forward into a different position in our lives in general. So just like everybody's experiencing change, change was something that I expected out of here, so I can approach it in a little bit. Obviously, I did not expect this, but it's something that I expected for that, so I can maybe handle it a little bit in a slightly different way. But the way that we're moving forward is we're not just approaching board games. That's not what we're planning. We're not just planning on doing that. We're planning on approaching RPGs. We're planning on approaching video games. Gauntlet Entertainment is called Entertainment for a reason, and it's an opportunity for us to explore different avenues and see in which way those different mediums can also come together with board games, meld other audiences within the board game structure, and utilize this amazing connective power that these games have. Tabletop games do an amazing job of formulating community, bringing people together from different diverse backgrounds, bringing people together around the table to be forced to engage with each other in a way that I don't have anything else that's relative in my life that I can see does as good of a job as this. And what we want to do with Rose Gauntlet is not only the ability to explore different passions, but use those passions and those different mediums to also bring people into the amazing, wonderful world that is the tabletop community. and show them that this can be so much for your life. It can be life-changing. It's not just cardboard and paper sitting in front of you.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and I think if we start understanding that and appreciating that and honoring that a little bit more, we're going to be just fine.
That's awesome. Well, before we wrap up, I'm just going to leave this opportunity. Like, that's a really great note. Any lingering thoughts people have? I know there were a lot of things we could have talked about, but anybody have any other things they just want to get out before we wrap up?
I don't think so.
Cool.
I think we nailed it.
Well, let's just say goodbye.
Yeah. Well, I want to know like what projects people have upcoming.
Okay. As Kathleen was saying, what projects do people have? Sorry, go ahead and whoever wants to begin. Kathleen, since you brought it up, why not?
Well, I did mention my game Grease Lightning is coming out, so from WizKids, so check that out. But the thing I really want to make sure that people know about is that my website, KathleenMercury.com, I post all of my game design teaching resources for free. They're used K through 12 at the collegiate level. They're even being used in some war colleges in the U.S. and in Norway, so that's kind of cool. They like how I explain mechanics. So if you know anyone who wants to teach game design, if you're interested, I make no money from it. It is just purely a labor of love to pay forward to many other wonderful teachers who would like those resources. So feel free to pass those on or use those yourself at KathleenMercury.com.
Awesome.
And buy Grease Lightning. That I do what I do.
Buy Grease Lightning, everyone.
I put my orders in today for it.
Yay! Oh, that's so cool. That's so
exciting.
cool. Oh my gosh. Oh, it's getting real. Okay, that's me.
Cool. Well,
Isaac,
I'll go
what
ahead.
are you doing?
Yeah, I'll go ahead and go next. Obviously, I've mentioned Rose Gauntlet a couple times. We have a new game called Keystone North America. It's going to be coming out on Kickstarter May 18th, and it would mean the absolute world to me if you would check it out.
I'm so psyched for it.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you
so psyched.
And like this is going to be the catalyst to see if Rose Gauntlet's going to be able to take off and do a whole bunch of other things. We announced a few other titles earlier this year that you can check out on our website, www.rosegauntlet.com. If you want to see any of those projects come to life, supporting Keystone is going to be the pathway to make sure that all happens. So I would really appreciate your guys' support. Again, it's going to be on Kickstarter May 18th. And you can follow me and Rose Gauntlet at Rose Gauntlet on any of the social media platforms that you're into. We're on all of them.
Yeah, I think your games have a real knack for truly capturing the human experience in a board game form, because I've played a number of your different games and different themes, and it's just remarkable. So I'm really excited for you to see where this goes. I know we're probably breaking the flow of this, but I just wanted to say that.
Well, thank you.
I was going to break it a little bit because I'm not actually a game designer, even though someone said we all are. But I actually do have 2 games that I have helped design coming out at some point. So
Yay!
we'll see
That's exciting.
Congratulations.
Yeah, we'll see what credits I get, but they're, who knows? I don't really care too much. I had fun working on them. That's what I cared about.
Cool. Get paid for future work, though.
Right? Exactly.
Okay.
Paul, why don't we go with you and then we'll end with Kathleen?
Sure. Yeah. So my game store, Games and Stuff, it's one of the biggest game stores in the Mid-Atlantic. Thanks to the pandemic, we're now a fully functioning e-commerce site. So you can buy games from me if you like at gamesandstuffonline.com. And again, as I mentioned, I'm also co-owner of Free RPG Day, which this year is going to be in October. So make sure you check with your friendly local game store if they're going to participate in that. They can sign up and make sure that they've got all the goodies at freerpgday.com.
Paul, can you get me Digimon cards? I'm obsessed with Digimon right now.
So that's a whole conversation we can have. Trading cards right now, man. It's insane.
I know.
It's insane. It's a whole new world out there.
Catherine.
Yeah, I have a game called Flipping Gravity that'll be coming to Kickstarter next year. It's pretty cool.
So
You should
excited
check
for
it
the
out when it
concept.
comes. And I'm always hanging around the remote playtesting Discord, RPT. Yeah, and I'll hopefully be pitching some more games soon that'll come out in the future, maybe.
Yay.
Awesome.
And I'm on Twitter a lot at Play Nyctophobia, just talking into the void. So
Catherine, who's
you can
making
come.
Flipping Gravity again?
New Mill Industries,
Nice.
I think. Yeah.
Thank you.
Cool. It sounds like they used to like turn wheat into flour, and then industry in America is like, well, board games, so all right. It's a really good example of a corporate pivot. So well done, them. Well done.
I understand the price of paper pulp is going up. So.
I think the price of everything is going up.
Yeah.
Yes.
Cool.
Well, let's say a real goodbye since I'm such a doofus.
You're not a doofus. Thank you for having us, Jackson.
Thank you
fun.
for having
Thanks so
us,
much.
It's all you.
Appreciate
It's
it.
all of you. Thank you all so much for joining me. A real goodbye, everyone. Thank you all so much.
Okay. Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks,
Bye.
everybody.
Bye.